Please pray with me. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Who is my neighbor, the lawyer asks, but really the intent of the question is to find out, who do I not have to care about? And Jesus answers, you care about anyone who needs love and care, regardless of whether they are your enemy or not. It sounds like a repeat of last week's sermon, which was all about welcoming the stranger, opening our hearts and our homes to those who are most vulnerable by virtue of their outsider status. But Amy Jill Levine cautions against interpreting this well-known passage as though it were only about lending aid to whoever is a part of the oppressed minority or outcast group. This is not a parable about poor old Samaritans despised by their mean old Jewish neighbors. Earlier in the same chapter, if you remember, Jesus was rejected by a Samaritan village who certainly didn't come across as the poor old outcast group. That's because, according to the scholars, Samaritans as a group despise Jews as much as Jews as a group despise Samaritans. They were mutually antagonistic toward each other. To get a full impact of the parable, Levine says, you have to imagine yourself down in the ditch and then ask yourself, is there anyone from any group about whom we'd rather die than acknowledge she offered help or he showed compassion? Or is there any group whose members might rather die than help us? Now, maybe that doesn't sound extraordinary to you. Of course, we would acknowledge compassion received from someone, even if they were considered our enemy. Of course, we would help anyone, regardless of how we felt about them in the past. But I've read online this week, some people say that those MAGAs down in Texas got what they deserved from the terrible storm they had last week. And I wonder, when mentioning that fact, how many of us immediately bring to mind the way that some of their kind have treated or might treat us. Every conflict that I have ever observed in church, inside of families, between congregants, including conflicts that have involved me, have some aspect of, but you started it. But you hurt me first. Why should I show you kindness when you haven't shown it to me? It brings to mind the story that one of you told me during the Iraq War, when your young child turned to you in this worship service during the prayers of the people and literally gasped, "Pastor Andrew just prayed for George Bush." It seemed shocking to the young one that we would ask God to guide someone and see their humanity when that person had done things that made them seem like our enemy. The parable suggests that love should be shown whenever and wherever it is needed, regardless of whether the past suggests that it is not deserved. This is really hard stuff. Yet imagine how it could change the world if loving aid were rendered whenever the situation called for it, regardless of whether that person's past or their group affiliation justified it in the minds of those in a position to render aid. In Jesus' telling, the neighbor is not a social object, in the words of Paul Ricoeur, but a behavior in the first person. I love that. The neighbor is not a social object, but a behavior in the first person. Ricoeur says that being a neighbor lies in the habit of making oneself available, as Flora said. It lies in the habit of making oneself available. And Jesus' words, "Go and do likewise," at the end of the parable, turns it into a pattern for action. One does not have a neighbor, Ricoeur says. I make myself someone's neighbor. Ricoeur goes on to point out that the people who do not stop to help in the parable are defined by their social function. They are absorbed by their roles, he says. Their social functions occupy them to a point of making them unavailable for the surprise of an encounter. He goes on to name with some irony that the ecclesial institution in the parable is what makes them unavailable to be part of the event of making oneself neighbor to the person in need. This makes me wonder about all the things that keep us separated from each other. Human being to human being, person to person, all the layers of race, religion, political or national allegiance, cultural assumptions, class status, language, all the roles that we both occupy and fear that keep us from the essential human connection. When you're down in the ditch, of course, all of that kind of distinction fades into the background as you cry out for help from wherever you can find it. Anyone who's ever worked in an ER or as a paramedic knows that this is true. It's one of the many reasons that I worry for people who have never had the experience of being down in that ditch. You can miss out on seeing how those social roles are so often artificial ones. Barriers to seeing your own stripped down human self, much less seeing the humanity of another. It often reinforces the correlation that I've often witnessed on the street, that people who have been on the down and out themselves are often, not always, but often more generous than those who have been insulated from vulnerability of many kinds. Now, it is possible that this focus on the intimate, person-to-person, neighbor-to-neighbor relationship could serve to limit our faithful action to the personal, individual realm. Indeed, Ricoeur says that one reading of this parable is to denounce the modern world as a world without the neighbor, the dehumanized world of abstract, anonymous, and distant relationships. And Ricoeur was writing this in 1965, before the internet. I would add to his critique the consumerist culture that often seeks to limit the way that we see each other as objects, judged by how well we fulfill each other's consumerist appetites. The clerk at the store is seen only for the way that she facilitates the transaction. And that model works its way into every aspect of our lives. But Ricoeur is more of a pragmatist. The same institutions in our culture, he says, that can objectify people also the ones through which a great deal of justice can be distributed. The ultimate meaning of institutions, he writes, is the service which they render to persons. The ultimate meaning of institutions is the service which they render to persons. Ultimately, it is the impact of our love on individual persons which will be judged whether that service is rendered person to person or through institutions. When an institution objectifies individuals, it fails its test. When an institution designed for distributed justice becomes imbued with an inhumane mentality because of the anonymity of the people that it serves, it fails its test. Whenever an oligarchy is established and uses this equipment as a means for domination and not for service, he writes in 1965, it fails. The important thing is that that institution is judged on the same basis by which our human-to-human interactions are judged. And that is the impact that it has on individual persons. Call it the neighbor ethic. I wonder how our politics might change if we judged every single one of our policies this way. What effect will this or that policy have on the service which it renders to persons? What effect does this institution have, public, private, or civic, on the service which it renders to persons? I wonder how it might change the way that we judge our church, the life of our church. What effect does this or that action, this or that activity have on the service which is rendered to persons? And how might our personal lives change if we judge our actions on how well we make ourselves available to those in need? Praying for the strength to love whenever it is needed. Whenever it is needed, regardless of whether the past suggests that it may not be deserved. Tim Snyder, in that little book on tyranny, offers 20 short meditations from the 20th century on how ordinary people can resist tyrannical regimes. A lot of the book I think I characterize as the principles or basic ethics of citizenship in a democracy. Number 13 stood out to me as so simple as to be overlooked. Make eye contact and small talk. Now, Snyder is a historian, and he says that people who have lived through tyrannical regimes in the 20th century, whether fascist Italy in the 20s, or Nazi Germany in the 30s, or the Soviet Union during the Great Terror of the late 30s, or the purges of communist Eastern Europe in the 40s and 50s, all seem to share, he says, some kind of a similar memory. And that is the memory of how their neighbors treated them during this period. How their neighbors treated them during this period. A smile, a handshake, or a word of greeting, he writes. Banal gestures in a normal situation took on great significance when friends, colleagues, and acquaintances looked away or crossed the street to avoid contact. Fear grew. Fear grew. Snyder says, look, you may not always know who feels threatened among you, but if you affirm everyone, if to affirm everyone, you can be sure that certain people will feel better. I think the hardest part of Jesus' parable today is that someone has to make the first move when it comes to ending this enemy-making cycle. Someone has to actively engage the person near them who is in need of compassion with that sort of grace, whether by virtue of their past behavior or their group affiliation. You decide that it's deserved or not. Someone or some group has to make themselves into someone else's neighbor by virtue of their pattern of action. But maybe taking that leap of faith, as difficult as it is not even as difficult as the revelation that the Samaritan's action in this parable is motivated by his deep compassion for the man in the ditch. That internal, gut-level feeling that is planted in every human being overrides all the other things that would keep him from tending to that person in the ditch. This suggests to me that the internal work of deepening compassion is just as important as making myself busy with righteous things, especially maybe for those of us who are at risk of being absorbed by our roles, making a habit of praying for my enemies, putting myself in their shoes as best I can, sympathizing with their hurts, enough to connect with them at that core human level. As difficult as this work is, Jesus suggests that it leads to life, that it leads to real freedom. It unlocks the highest level of joy and hope, which may not be able to be accessed in any other way.